I'm going to talk about oral fluid screening. Oral fluid, otherwise known as saliva or spit, has dominated my life for the last several years. It's a sad commentary on what I do for a living. This is just a picture of a young lady giving an oral fluid sample. This is not a point of contact thing, but I should mention that if anybody asks, I am thinking of my wife, whose birthday is very soon, and I have been away for her birthday every year consistently for 25 years. So I am thinking about her. So, drug testing, drug screening in particular. Everybody wants the magic box. Plug them into the magic box, determine what drug they're on and whether they're impaired. Well, if you really want a good magic box, what you want is blood. Actually, I've heard that what you really want is a sample of brain tissue. That would solve the drugs and driving problem very, very quickly. But nobody is about to suggest that we start taking samples of brain tissue, especially at roadside. It just gets a little messy. We're also not likely to start taking samples of blood at the side of the road either. Even in the state of Arizona, where the police officers can be trained as phlebotomists and take their own blood samples, they don't do it at the side of the road. So when we go back and look at where drug screening has been over the last many, many years, everybody agrees that blood is what you want, but that's just not going to happen easily. The original drug screening devices were based on urine. Urine's a good substance to use because you can get it relatively easily in most cases. You can ask the DREs when they do their evaluations that there are certain people who just simply cannot pee on demand. One of the problems with urine is that the results indicate past use. It measures metabolites, not active drug. So they're very, very different. But oral fluid, in oral fluid, you can get active drug. And that's the advantage of oral fluid. There are lots of disadvantages as well, which we'll talk about a little bit. But it measures recent drug use and it measures active drug use. So when you're looking for cannabis, you're detecting delta-9 THC. You're not looking at the carboxy metabolite, you're looking at the active drug. There's been a lot of stuff in the media lately about a breath test for cannabis. The podolyzer, I think the cannibalizer is a better name. That too will probably solve the drugs and driving problem. As a member of the Drugs and Driving Committee that's evaluating these devices, I have yet to see the breath test. I've seen pictures of it in the media, and if you look at it really, really closely, the guy holding the breath test device for cannabis, it's actually an intoxilizer that is used to test alcohol. If it's coming, I haven't seen it. I suspect it's several years away, and the immediate disadvantage of that is it tests for one substance. As we all know, it's probably the most important substance out there, the most prevalent substance out there, but it certainly isn't the only one. So, why oral fluid? Well, we want something that's easy to use, easy to collect, and something that we can do at the side of the road. Easily and quickly. It's got to be unobtrusive. You're not going to stick somebody with a needle at the side of the road. So it's non-invasive, relatively speaking. There are different opinions of how invasive it is to stick a little swab in somebody's mouth. By the way, we do that all the time with breath test tubes. You stick it in your mouth. And as I mentioned before, it tests for active drug, not the metabolites. Now, the little graphic here, that is actually one of the oral fluid screening devices that was originally tested in a European study. The Europeans like to call their big multinational projects by pet names. And this one was called the Rosita Project, and they evaluated a number of these oral fluid screening devices. And one of them actually had a little plastic cup, and the driver was to spit into the cup. Well, you can just imagine how the officers evaluating that thought about that little exercise. You have a driver who's possibly impaired by drugs, trying to spit into a cup. The test was if you hit the cup, you're good to go. So, oral fluid drug screening is now almost exclusively based on the collection of an oral fluid sample from the mouth, generally under the tongue or inside of the cheek. There's one that uses fluid from the tongue. And it collects it on a cellulose swab, and it's put into a device that actually reads it. So let's have a look at oral fluid for just a second. It's mostly water, that fluid in your mouth. It's got lots of different purposes. It helps digestion. It also assists in oral health, dental health. And most people can generate enough oral fluid relatively quickly to be able to test for drugs. Certain drugs diminish the flow of oral fluid. Cannabis happens to be one of them, but that doesn't seem to interfere with collecting enough to be able to test it. Drugs enter the oral fluid by a simple process of diffusion from the blood through the salivary glands into the fluid. Most of the drug that you're detecting, most likely we suspect, is from drug residue in the mouth. And that's particularly the case with cannabis. When you smoke cannabis, one of the signs that the dairies look for is this greeny film on the tongue. But there's residue in the mouth that is full of THC, and it is collected along with it. That's probably what we're detecting a lot of. So when you look at oral fluid cannabis concentrations, you got to be real careful. But that's not of concern to us here, because all we're interested in is detecting it. When you get an oral fluid cannabis concentration in the thousands of nanograms, you're pretty certain that that driver has used cannabis recently. In fact, they're probably smoking it in the car while they're driving. What happens when you get the sample and you put it in the cartridge and stick it in the magic box is that it reacts with the antibodies on the test cartridge and the reader reads. So we get a pretty good indication of which drugs are present. So the question that everybody has to start with is, does it work? Just to give you a little bit of background, the Drugs and Driving Committee of the Canadian Society of Forensic Science is one of two committees that are funded by the Department of Justice. The other one being the Alcohol Test Committee, which some of you are probably more familiar with. Their job is to actually test breath alcohol testing devices and approve them for use. They approve them, and they send a note to the Attorney General of Canada who puts them on the approved device list. The Drugs and Driving Committee, to this point, has simply provided the Department of Justice with advice on the drugs and driving problem. Our role is rapidly changing. We were asked a number of years ago to look at oral fluid screening devices and determine their validity and the feasibility of using such devices to assess drug use by drivers at the side of the road. So I'm not going to get into a lot of the study here. I'm talking this afternoon in one of the other sessions. I can tell you all about exactly what we did. But just quickly, we wanted a number of active drug users to go out and just randomly test people in the population and look for drugs is rather inefficient. So we went down to the DRE certification sessions and collected samples from people who would be evaluated. And that typically involves going to a known center where there are drug users who come to you. We collected 2 samples from each driver. One was with one of the oral fluid screening devices. One was a regular oral fluid sample that was sent to a confirmatory lab. We used 3 different devices. So we had data on at least 3 different devices so that we could tell whether overall the concept of oral fluid screening worked. We weren't interested in looking at the particular device characteristics, but we wanted to look at whether the concept was good. Now, just a little bit of a spoiler alert here. I'm going to give you the results later on, but I'll tell you quickly what they are here. We were looking for 6 categories of drugs. Within each category, there may be more than one substance because there's cross-reactivity among the various drugs that we're Certainly cannabis was one of the handles that was on the devices. Cocaine, methamphetamine, opioids, and the two that didn't come out very well, by the way, were methamphetamines and benzodiazepines. Benzodiazepines are widely used in North America, but more so in Europe, actually, and they don't cross into the oral fluid very well, so they're very, very difficult to detect. So the question then becomes, okay, they work. We can detect drugs very quickly and easily at the side of the road. And by quickly, I'm talking about 6 or 7 minutes, which is considerably longer than a breath test. A breath test you can do literally seconds. This takes a while. So we have to look at a procedure as to how this would work. Now, what I'm going to tell you here is my opinion. This comes from nobody but me. But this is how I see them working. And I think what we want to do is create a situation that is very parallel to what we're doing with alcohol. So a driver stopped at the side of the road, or they're in a checkpoint of some kind, whatever you call it in a particular province. If the officer can develop some suspicion of alcohol use, then they'll proceed to the next step. Suspicion of alcohol use is fairly easy to determine. Most people can smell it. I can't. I can't smell alcohol at all. My wife can smell if I had a beer when I'm 3 blocks from home. But there are other things that most people can look at a person and determine whether or not they've been drinking, especially if they've had a sufficient amount of alcohol to cause things like slurred speech, fumbling with things that in their hands as they're getting a license out or whatever. There's lots of indicators of alcohol use that are pretty obvious to most people. Moving to the next step, at this point the officer can either use a standardized field sobriety test or pull out his approved screening device and take a breath sample. That provides him with reasonable and probable grounds to either issue an administrative suspension pending reading or take him downtown for an evidential breath test. We've been doing that for a good number of years now. I think we're pretty good at it. We've got that down pat. Developing a parallel procedure for drugs is going to be a little tricky. First of all, before we ever get to the oral fluid screening device, we've got to have suspicion. You've got to have some reason to go to the next step. What are the signs and symptoms of cannabis use? Not everybody knows. Not all police officers know. Unless you're looking for them and you know what you're looking for, you're never going to see them. We need to understand what those clues are and get that information out to the people who are actually going to be doing this. Once you've got suspicion, you have the standardized field sobriety test which you use. Now, Tracy mentioned that the Ontario government is looking at possibly improving the tests that are used as part of a drug standardized field sobriety test, and the Americans are looking at that too. And then comes the magic box. That's what we're looking for, the oral fluid screening. We had the oral fluid screening device. We could take a sample right there at the side of the road and determine whether or not that person needs to go downtown for a drug recognition evaluation. Oral fluid screening is not going to get rid of DREs. It's going to help them. It's going to make that process a little simpler. We can also use oral fluid screening as a way to issue comparable administrative suspensions that we do for alcohol. So if you have 3-day suspension for alcohol over 50, we can give a similar suspension for someone who has a positive oral fluid screening. One of the differences between the alcohol screening and the drug screening is the alcohol will give you an indication of the level of the alcohol present in the person's system. Oral fluid screening will not do that for drugs. Once we get the person downtown, we'll go for a DRE evaluation, and hopefully we will get to blood tests from that point. Blood is not easy to get, and there's all kinds of reasons for that. We can change that legislation fairly quickly. So the next step. So now that we've got these things that we know work, We can detect drugs on the side of the road fairly easily, at least certain classes of drugs. We cannot detect everything, but we can detect certain classes of drugs. By the way, the most commonly found drugs at the side of the road. The next step really is, as one police officer told me, you give them to the cops and see how long it takes them to break it. And that's field testing. So we want to put them in the hands of police officers and let them try it. See what problems they have, see what they like about it, see what they don't like about it, and see how it works. That will also feed into the standards. One of the things that we're going to have to do before we start using these things is have standards for oral fluid screening devices. Just like alcohol test devices, these things will have to meet a certain standard for use in Canada. We need to develop those standards. On this front, we're looking primarily at the UK standards, who introduced oral fluid screening just over a year ago. They have some pretty tough standards. Once we have standards, the manufacturers will be invited to submit their devices for testing. Testing an oral fluid screening device is expensive and time-consuming. It's not a matter of blowing a few breath samples through a simulator into an alcohol test device. This requires a toxicologist in a lab for a minimum of 1 month. Solid. That's expensive. That's really expensive. We have to not only free up the toxicologist to do this, in their spare time, but it's a lot of resources that are invested in this. Then we need new legislation. I understand there's a bill for Parliament right now that would facilitate this, but we're a long ways from having that bill actually passed into law. Then we have the training program. Okay, we've got devices, we've got them approved. How are we going to use them? So I give you a bit of a model as to where I think they may go. But we have to train officers to do this. And everybody's got to do it the same way. We have to teach them about suspicion. We can't have DREs. We don't have enough DREs to have them on the street all the time. We've got between 500 and 600 across Canada. Their role is better off elsewhere. Then we have to train them in the use of these devices. Well, every device is a little bit different. The concept is the same, but every device is a little bit different. Then we're at the implementation stage. That's expensive too. This is not going to be cheap. Whereas a breath test tube is going to cost you literally pennies. Each oral fluid screener test that you do is going to cost anywhere from $25 to $35. That adds up very, very quickly. So just in closing, a few points to remember. These devices, even though I say they work, they do not work for all drugs. They will not include all drugs. It is not a generic drug screener. It doesn't work that way. One of the things that we'll talk about this afternoon when I give my other presentation is that the miss rate and false alarm rates are there. They're not perfect. And it's the false alarm, that is the positive results that really aren't related to drug use, that are a problem for the criminal justice system. Defense lawyers. We need to look at that. It is unlikely that oral fluid screening devices will not be evidential. You will probably not introduce the oral fluid screening result in court, other than to say it was your reasonable and probable grounds. There is another sample that will be needed to prove drug use. And hopefully that will be blood. Presently we're using a lot of urine, and there's good reasons for that, but I'm not going to get into that right now. The other thing to remember is that oral fluid screening devices do not detect impairment. They are not impairment detectors. All they detect is recent drug use. And it does not remove the need for drug recognition experts. We need to continue that program and expand it. Oral fluid is a tool. It's another tool that we can use. It's not the answer. It's not the solution to this problem. It's another tool that we have in our box that we can use to tackle this problem. And that's That's all I have to say.